Hi and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day today. For our tutorial here on YouTube today, I'd like to share my wire spiral beaded shield ring. Now that's an absolute mouthful and I haven't actually decided what order the words should be in, but I think it's a really beautiful design and I hope that you will enjoy making along with me. Let's head down to the board and get cracking on that technique. So let's take a closer look at our project together today. It's a spiral ring that is beaded, two different beaded techniques. I've got a lovely wound on open bead on one side and then a slight variation on channel setting on the other side. Let's remove that mandrel for now. So it's variation of a shield ring in so much as it's kind of domed, it's got a little bit of shape to it, it's very, very comfortable indeed to wear. This is quite a large size one, that's probably about a size Q in the UK. I guess that's about a 9 in the United States, I'm not 100% sure. So that's quite a large one. We're going to refer back to that every now and again, so I'll pop that in the top corner. In terms of materials today, I have some 1.25mm gauge wire, equivalent to approximately 16 gauge in the States, and this is around about 11 inches. Now that's probably a little more than we actually need, but we're going to start by making sure that it's nicely flush cut on both ends, and I'm going to give that a nice smooth through to add a little bit of fluidity just whilst I'm working on it. So let's start with this end and we'll grab in some round nose pliers. So if you want to add a bead in the centre, you absolutely can. I quite like being able to see skin through that central spot part of the spiral, but you can absolutely add a bead in if you want to. You could add a nice sparkly Swarovski. Absolutely up to you what you do there. So bearing in mind whether or not you want to add something in the centre of that spiral should give you an idea of how large you want that first central space to be. So I'm just going to wing it and see what that looks like. Flip that over. The main thing I want to make sure is that the cut end of that wire is going to touch the next circuit of wire that comes around, and the reason being I don't want that to pick on any skin or catch on any clothes or anything like that, so I'm just going to make sure that those two sections touch as close as possible to one another. If you are making for somebody with very tiny fingers, you'll probably want to keep these spirals quite close at the centre of the ring. However, when you get towards the outer section of this spiral, you will absolutely need to allow that to open up. So I've gone for one turn and then two turns, and the gap in between is too small for beads, but it's a nice effect to work with at the centre of your ring. I'm now going to allow the third half circuit to just splay out a little bit so that there will be space for my beads. In terms of the beads that I'm using, I have some 4mm amethyst smooth rounds to work with. We'll also be adding in some lighter wire, that is 0.4mm or 26 gauge, coming up in a little while. So I'm going to go a little bit further around. I think that that looks good for the top half of the ring. Doesn't matter which way up you actually wear it, but I'm thinking of the side which has the beads in that sort of channel setting. They sit quite high above the channel so that the ring is comfortable to wear, but you do need to allow space to get in there with your wire when you're weaving and sewing everything together. So if you prefer, you can make the spiral happen by using your hands. If you find that you're a little bit grippy with your pliers and you make tool marks, that might be the way forwards for you. So once we've got the first half done, bearing in mind we'll be adding a second piece of wire in a moment. This is pretty good size-wise for what I'm looking for. That's fairly representative of the shape and size I want to go for. So what we're going to do now is to draw the wire down and away from us. So if I grab hold of that wire just at the point I want it to turn, which is around about there, I'm going to push the wire down and away, bearing in mind that that is how it's going to sit on the finger. I'm just going to give that a quick warm through. The reason I'm warming it and curving it is because I want to be able to show you that from overhead. So the wire has come down and away from the ring itself. We're now going to use the ring stick or mandrel to help us give a little bit of doming shape to that coil or spiral at the centre of the ring. Now I tend to find that this slightly heavier wire springs back out a little bit, so I'm going to use it slightly further down the mandrel than the size I'm aiming for. So if I was aiming for around about here, which is about a size N, that's around about a size 6 or 7, I think, something like that, 7 maybe. And what I will do is I'll take it 2 sizes smaller so that I can push that spiral over the dome of the ring stick to give that kind of shield impression. Now if you're lucky enough to own ring bending pliers, they're actually quite handy for a technique like this. Although it's not forming the shank of the ring, which is where one would normally use ring bending pliers, you can use those pliers to help create this shape as well. You could also use a little sort of doming block, not in the way it's meant to be used, but still. I'm just going to allow my bent chain nose pliers, my workhorse pliers, to help me anyway. So we've now got a little bit of a dome over the top so that when you wear this ring it's more comfortable and it's less stuck up and less likely to catch on things, to be honest. So now we need to get the size of the ring in question. So I think around about here is where I want to go today. You can of course obtain ring sticks that have numbers on them. This is my old faithful workhorse, and I'm just going to allow that wire to just complete the circle of the shank, like so, and then I'll just try that on the finger that I'm aiming to fit. So that looks reasonable. I might tighten that up ever so slightly in a moment, but I want you to see that we've got a gentle dome on the top, on the head of the ring, and then the shank is sitting round underneath. You can of course make this slightly tighter, bearing in mind you will need to leave space for your beads to sit inside on one side of the design. I think actually what I might do is bring the wire over the top this way and put the beads around the top here, and then I'll show you 2 alternative designs. So once I've decided that this is the correct size, that's fitting the finger that I want it to fit, I might actually just close that up slightly more. Overall I'm quite happy with that. I'm going to bring the tail of the wire now in the opposite direction to the travel on the other side. So if I just grip across that shank wire and pull it towards me, I'll just hold that still for a moment so you can see and understand what's happening. We've got a spiral, the wire has come down and underneath, and then it's travelling in the opposite direction from where the spiral came from. And what we're going to do is just smooth and warm the wire through. Get a little bit of heat into it. You might want to just ever so slightly and gently edit the angle at which that travels away. And then we're going to allow this to circle round using the warmth of the wire and its natural propensity to do bending for you. It does want to. I think I've made that angle a little bit sharp, so I'm just going to open that out. If I hold the angle like so and just pull that away, what that means is I can adjust the spiral on top, or the second half of the spiral that we're creating, so that there's enough space for my beads to sit in this side. So I am going to take a second extra just to get that to sit how I want it to. That's better. Just needed to adjust that with the pliers. So there's enough space now in this aperture up at the top for me to channel set. It's a form of channel setting. It's not the traditional channel setting like you would see on a traditional metalsmith or silversmith's ring, but that's what we're going to work towards today. So I have now a good couple of inches of wire over the end. We only need around about probably just less than an inch, so I'm going to trim that away to 1 inch. And I've still had slightly more than I needed, so there's about 2 inches there. We've ended up using around about 9 inches of wire, but I would allow 11 so that you can err on the side of caution, just in case your spiral gets quite spirally. So as ever, when I'm recording this tutorial today, I've come up with a slightly different way of doing things. So I'm going to show you both variations today. I'll talk you through how I made the display piece, and I'll demonstrate to you an alternative so that you can have channel set beads on both sides of the head of that ring. We're now going to add in some finer gauge wire, which we will use to set our beads. I'm using 4mm round amethyst beads. They're smooth as opposed to faceted. You can use whatever beads you want, but do bear in mind if you use much larger than 4mm beads, your ring is going to be chonking huge. So let's grab a length of wire. This is around about 18 inches of 26 gauge 0.4mm wire. And I'm going to start by winding the wire on several times around any good point that you find. So I think probably just here is as good a place as any. And I'm going to grab my bent chain nose pliers. I really want this to be a very strong connection. So rather than just 3 wraps around, I think I'll probably go for 5 wraps. And once I've done that, I'll make sure that it's nice and neat and tidy, and I'll show you that once it's still. It's very, very easy to get carried away and have everything moving around. So let's make sure that that end is nice and tidy. Ideally, we don't ever want the very end of the wire. That looks a little bit pointy actually, so I'm just going to trim that away. Into the scrap pot you go, naughty sharp piece of wire. And I'm going to just tighten up that coil and make sure that that end section is super flush to the design. Ideally, I want to have the very end of that cut section inside this section of wire so that it physically can't interact with your skin. So let's just rotate this around to a good position. My finer gauge wire is coming over the top of the heavier gauge wire. Let's add in the first one of those lovely smooth amethyst beads. If I can actually find the end, there we go. Slide that down like a zip line into position. So for the first half, what we're looking to do is to sit our beads in a channel created by the spiral and then by the wire that leads around towards the cut end. Now the way we're going to do this is to wrap 5 times on the outside and 3 times on the inside wire. Now this is fiddly to show, not fiddly to do. What I tend to do here is make a little hook in the leading edge of that cut end of wire, and I'm going to hook that just underneath and back up and through, and I'm going to support that wire. This is quite a firm wire I'm using today, and just pull that into position. Now at this stage that can move around, it's really no drama. The reason I go for 3 wraps on the inside and 5 wraps on the outside is it looks really beautifully graduated. So you can reform that hook and just pull that up and around again. And we're looking for, like I said, 3 times around the inner side of the 2 little tracks that we're creating as a channel. Pop that back up and through. You can use whichever technique you feel most comfortable with. Oh, I've taken that through too many times. Let's bring that back around. Here we go. So I've got my 3 wraps. I'm just going to scooch the wires together to make that nice and neat. Now for the outside, just here, the reason I haven't completed the shield or the head of the ring is it's much easier taking that pass of wire underneath the channel, so underneath the head of the ring. I'm just going to allow that to slip around, pull that really firmly, and we're going to wrap 5 times. So having this entry point over here means that you don't have to mess around like we do on the inner section of wire. So I've got my 5 wraps. Let's just pull those away from the first coil, tighten that up neatly like so, and then we're going to add in the next bead. Now this is where having a little extra wire on the end really does pay, because it means if you do kink the wire by creating that small hook, it's not the end of the world. So we're going to now completely fill the first half of the outer spiral of our spiral ring with beautiful beads. So again, I'm just creating a little hook to allow that to slide through. When your wire gets tense, slow down. So I'm just going to put my thumb inside the loop of wire here, very, very gently controlling the way it moves. Sometimes what can happen is that you'll get a really naughty kink in the wire and it will cause you all kinds of aggro later on. So let's find the end of the wire here, pop that up and underneath. We're just sort of sewing at this stage. So this is your sewing wire. So that's the second one, and then the third one I'm going to allow to just pass directly underneath the channel scooch those up neat and tidily. So I've got 3 wraps on the inside, 5 wraps on the outside. It looks really beautiful when you do that. It gives you an elegant finish. Let's get that into proper focus down there for you. So what I'm going to do off camera now is just continue to fill this first half of the section. So I'll move all the way along this outer edge of the spiral just on the one side. I may need to just move the centre of my spiral around as I go, and I'll join you back down here in just a moment. So I've added all of the beads as I indicated I would in the first side of the head of the ring in the channel. It's now completely finished off. I had around about 1.5 inches of remaining lighter gauge wire, that 0.4 or 26 gauge, which I've simply wound around the sticky outy bit on the end here. So let's head back down to the board and I'll show you the 2 different ways in which you can finish this beaded spiral ring. So as you can see, I've filled that upper gap and created a little light channel setting after a fashion at least. And what we can do at this stage is just make sure that everything is going as we desire. We can also, with the help of those beads, make sure that our spiral is nicely domed still. Once you've got the added security of those beads and the winding wire or the sewing wire, it gives you a little bit more strength and you can just press that down a little bit more firmly. So there are now 2 ways in which you can finish this ring. The way I finished the ring earlier on, my demonstration piece, is that I added beads to the outside of the spiral, and I'll show you on this design where that would be. They would continue all the way around like so. But I actually quite like the idea of bringing the beads inside the spiral on the lower side here. So in order to seal the ring and make sure that the size stays good and true, what we're going to do is to take this last little sticky outy bit, and this happens regardless of which technique you use to finish off the second half of the head of the ring. What we're going to do is give that some lovely warmth and then push it through the centre, down through the shank of the ring. You might need to just curve that. We're going to take that around. Now this is a heavier wire to work with, so it does pay to just be slow and definite to make sure that that does go all the way around. And we're going to trim that after just one circuit. This is a ring, it's not a mountain climbing apparatus. It needs to be secure, but it doesn't need to carry an elephant. So I've trimmed away the end section just there, and what we're going to do is tidy up and tighten that last small section. So this piece here with the added winding is just where I had an excess of that finer gauge sewing wire. If you don't want it to be wound around like that, you can finish off with 5 wraps as you did all the way around the outside and trim away. I quite like the idea of having those few extra wraps, and that's why I continued winding. So I'm just going to make sure that that's nice and tight, and that the cut end sits as close as possible up into the ring, so that when I put that on my finger I don't feel any of the cut end. So again, I'm going to re-rounden the shank of the ring. It's just a little bit larger than I had desired, so I'm just going to pinch it to fix that problem, and that will make it slightly smaller when I take that across. It's nice and round again now. I'm really happy with how that's coming out. So there are 2 ways to proceed from here. We can add on another length of that 0.4mm gauge or 26 gauge wire and add beads to the outside, and that will look something like the one in my right hand. Or you can continue in the same vein and add beads between the 2 wires that have created this lower channel as you're looking at it now. So the choice is absolutely yours. We're going to start off by adding a length of wire, and I think I'll probably start just here. Again, it will be let me have a think, what am I using? It's 0.4mm 26 gauge wire, and I'll probably start with this time around about 12 inches. I don't need quite as much as I did on the first side, and I'll show you both techniques very quickly now. So if I start just here, we're going to begin by winding on 5 times, and that's for good security, and we want the coil to go towards the piece of the ring which has already got beads on it. and that will just kind of add like a repeating cycle to the winding and the coiling. So again, I would prefer, although we've got 3 and 3 and 3 all around the inside, for the sake of security and the longevity of your jewellery, I would definitely go for 5 wraps of this lighter gauge wire. So I've just got 3 there to begin with. I'm going to draw that around, tighten that up, and then we'll get some extra wraps in just a second. So if I grip hold of that with my nail, I'm going to dive that down between the 2 wires that create the channel. You may prefer to grip the coil of wire with your pliers. If you've got a nice sensitive touch, you can grip that wire without causing any damage to it. So we've now got those 5 visible wraps. Your option, if you want to channel set this section of the ring, is to continue in exactly the same way as you did up and above, which would be to add in a bead and then drop the end of the wire down in between the next 2 lines of the spiral, and I'll just zoom in for you now. So you'd add your bead, drop the end of the wire down in here between the inner spiral and the next one along, wrap 3 times, bring the wire naked across the back of the design, wrap 5 times around the outer of the 2 pieces you're working with, and then drop in the next bead, and so on and so forth until you have filled the channel just here. Now if you feel that you need to, before you continue any further, you can just modify how the spiral sits so you have enough room but not too much room to fit all those beads. I'm going to show you now how to make the beaded on the outside, the beaded ring that I made earlier on, which is in a very similar way to a couple of techniques we've worked with before. So let's just make sure that that coil is nice and safe and tidy, and then what we're going to do is add the bead to the single stretch on the outside of the head of the ring. So again, this is my least favourite part of creating a demonstration using beads, is finding the bead hole. My eyes ain't what they used to be, she says. Okay, so the wire is attached on. My finer gauge wire is coming from underneath the head of the ring now. I'm going to hold that bead into position, bring the wire all the way around the outside, over the top and down like so. I'll just bring that slowly until the bead sits exactly where I want it to. Now again, you can just take the end through, draw that around, and I think I'll go for 3 wraps because this is the inside and it will kind of reflect what we were doing earlier. So I've gone for 3 wraps just here. I've cast on with 5 wraps. The finer gauge wire has returned to being underneath. So let's just add 1 more bead in, and then I'll just repeat the differences between the 2 styles that you can create off the back of this tutorial, if I can find the bead hole. There it is. So slide the bead down into position. We're going to support that bead against the outside ridge of that wire. I'm going to just push that underneath my thumbnail, take the wire over the top of the ring, down through the outer and the next innermost piece, pull that nice and firmly into position. We're looking for enough tension to create a good section of wire work, but what we don't want to do is to snap those beads. Amethyst is really lovely to work with, it's quite sturdy. So I'm going to repeat that a second and a third time. Every time I pull that through, adding a little bit of tension, supporting the bead with my non-dominant hand, and then tightening up that coil before I move on. And what will happen is we will continue all the way around and you will end up with something that looks a little bit like this. So I have finished off with a couple of wraps around a single piece of wire, 5 wraps to be precise, and that's made everything nice and secure. So as I mentioned to you earlier, if you didn't want to have beads that are just sat on the outside by themselves, you could continue to channel set between the next 2 wires in. I'll pop a photograph on the end of today's video so you can see those 2 rings side by side. I hope that you've enjoyed the content and I look forward to seeing you back again very, very soon. Bye for now.